He was shot late this evening in front of his apartment building in New York City.
December 8th, 1980. If you were alive that night, you remember exactly where you were when the news broke. For millions of Americans, it came through their television sets, delivered by somber voices that struggled to make sense of the senseless. It was a Monday evening, and ABC had been broadcasting Monday Night Football, the Miami Dolphins versus the New England Patriots. Howard Cosell was in the booth, doing what he did best, calling the game with his distinctive cadence. But sometime around 11 p.m. Eastern Time, everything changed. Frank Gifford handed Cosell a piece of paper, and the sportscaster, who had interviewed John Lennon just days earlier, had to deliver news that no one wanted to hear. An unspeakable tragedy, confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. Cosell's voice cut through the ordinary rhythm of a football game. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all the Beatles, shot twice in the back, rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival. The words hung in the air like smoke. Dead on arrival. John Lennon. It didn't seem possible. Those watching football that night found themselves frozen, remote controls forgotten in their hands. Wives called to husbands in other rooms, parents stood motionless in doorways. For a generation that had grown up with the Beatles, that had screamed at Ed Sullivan, that had found meaning in cryptic lyrics and backward messages, that had made those four lads from Liverpool the soundtrack to their youth, this was more than celebrity news. This was personal. ABC News shifted into the mode that networks had perfected through too many tragedies. The somber tone, the scramble for information, the need to tell the story while it was still unfolding. As Monday Night Football concluded, the network's news division took over, piecing together what had happened outside the Dakota apartment building. The details emerged in fragments, each one more devastating than the last. John had been returning home with Yoko after a recording session. A fan had approached him. 5 shots. A .38 revolver. The gunman had simply waited, clutching a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. John had been rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, but there was nothing they could do. He was only 40 years old. For those tuning in throughout that long night, ABC became a conduit for collective grief. The network showed footage of the Beatles in their prime, those impossibly young faces, that infectious joy, the screaming crowds that represented a moment when the world felt young and anything seemed possible. They showed John's later years, the peace activism, the bed-ends with Yoko, the years of quiet domesticity raising his son Sean. They played clips from his recent interviews, where he'd seemed so happy, so content, talking about bread making and his 5 years away from music. The cruelest irony wasn't lost on anyone. John had just come back. After years of being a house husband in the Dakota, he'd returned to recording. Double Fantasy, his album with Yoko, had just been released in November. He'd been doing interviews talking about his renewed creative energy, his happiness, his hopes for the future. He was making plans. There were going to be more albums, more music, more John. ABC's cameras showed the scene outside Roosevelt Hospital, then outside the Dakota, where fans had already begun to gather in stunned clusters. Some were crying, others stood in silence. Many held candles that flickered in the December wind. The images broadcast into living rooms across America captured something profound. A nation in shock, unable to process that someone who'd been such a constant presence in their lives was suddenly, violently, gone. Throughout that night and into the next day, ABC continued its coverage. They interviewed music journalists, fellow musicians, anyone who could help make sense of it. But there was no sense to be made. A gifted young man had taken away one of the most gifted artists of the 20th century, a voice that had called for peace, that had asked us to imagine a better world, had been silenced by violence. The network showed the vigil at the Dakota growing larger. They covered the global reaction as news spread around the world. In Liverpool, Lennon's hometown, people wept in the streets. Radio stations played Beatles songs back to back. The music industry, still reeling, struggled to find words adequate to the loss. For those who watched ABC's coverage that night and in the days that followed, certain images remain indelible. The crowds outside the Dakota, growing larger by the hour, the flowers and messages piling up, the candles burning against the winter darkness. Yoko's simple, devastating statement: "John loved and prayed for the human race. Please do the same for him." That Sunday, December 14, ABC covered the global moment of silence that Yoko had requested. At 2 p.m. Eastern Time, for 10 minutes, the world stopped. The network showed Central Park, where hundreds of thousands had gathered. They showed London, Tokyo, Los Angeles. Everywhere, people standing together in silence, remembering John. For those who had turned to ABC News that Monday night in December, the coverage became part of how we process the unthinkable. In an era before the internet, before social media, before we could instantly share our grief with strangers around the world, television news was our gathering place. It was where we came together to witness history, even when that history broke our hearts. More than 40 years later, those of us who watched that night can still recall the shock, the disbelief, the crushing sadness. We remember Howard Cosell's voice breaking the news during a football game. We remember the footage of a younger John, so full of life and wit and music. We remember realizing that there would be no more new songs, no more clever interviews, no more evolution from the man who'd always been evolving. John once sang that life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. On December 8, 1980, life happened to all of us watching at home. The music stopped, and ABC News was there, helping a heartbroken nation begin to say goodbye to a legend who'd left us far too soon. The world would keep spinning, but it would spin a little quieter, a little dimmer, without John Lennon's voice in it.